Hey, good afternoon, patrons. It's Wednesday, October 6th. I've just completed my 3 days of academic training. I'm going to get 48 hours off waiting for my flight home here right now, and then come back for 3 days of simulator training, followed by a check ride on or about the 12th of October. Did you see the latest F-35 accident report that came out from the F-35 accident that occurred at Eglin Air Force Base, Florida, back on 19 May of 2020. This is a great report put out by the Air Force. The Air Force does their own accident investigations. They do an outstanding job of it. There's a lot of great information in here that even if you don't know much about the F-35, like is in my case, if you read this report, you'll learn more about the F-35 than many of the pilots and even the test pilots of the F-35 understood about that aircraft before this accident happened. This is a classic case of a snowball or a series of events that involves distraction, a lack of systems knowledge, over reliance on automation, night low visibility. It's basically a landing accident on this F-35 accident. If you land an aircraft too fast, coming in too fast, a classic situation develops called a porpoise. If you come in too hot, too fast, and you touch down either on the nose gear or on all three gear and subsequently bounce nose high, if you get the wrong control inputs into the aircraft, you can set up a series of porpoises. And this happens quite frequently. And this happened in the case of the F-35. And after about the second or so bounce, this mishap pilot elected to eject out of the aircraft as he overwhelmed the fly-by-wire flight control system. A couple things about fly-by-wire flight controls. Well, first, the F-35. The F-35 is designed to be inherently unstable. Unlike a transportation aircraft, and this is something that is lost in the 737 MAX debate, so many people think the 737 MAX is inherently unstable. It is not. It cannot be. It's a transportation category aircraft. It has to be aerodynamically inherently stable. The F-35 is a fighter aircraft. These fighter aircraft want to be inherently unstable so that they can maneuver quickly, and they require fly-by-wire flight systems to maintain their stability. One thing about a fly-by-wire flight system, and I've learned this from the Airbus, and you can see this on the internet quite frequently, if you put in a whole bunch of control input all at once, if you start stirring the pot, in other words, on final approach, and you see this in light aircraft too, pilots will start stirring the pot, excessive control inputs, rapid control inputs. In the case of the Airbus, the flight control computers will basically begin to ignore the pilot inputs. The flight control computers begin to say, this pilot doesn't know what he's doing, and in order to not overwhelm my processors, I'm going to ignore these pilot inputs, and it basically stabilizes the aircraft and ends up flying a pretty nice approach despite all the flailing by the pilot. What happens to your laptop computer if you got too many applications running at once? You overwhelm the processor, you start getting the circle of death, and things slow down. The same thing can happen with fly-by-wire flight control systems. The processing capability can slow down. That's critical in the landing phase. In order for a fly-by-wire aircraft to properly operate, it needs to understand what phase of flight it's in. If each phase of flight has a different series of control laws associated with it, whether you're in the landing phase, the approach phase, the cruise phase, or in the case of the F-35, I assume the combat phase. In the case of a bounced landing, where you want to go around after you bounce, after so much control input and operating the aircraft outside of its very narrow envelope, for the landing phase, it's very easy for the aircraft to begin to get confused as to which phase of flight do you want. Are we in the landing phase, or are we in the flying phase or the go-around phase? So why did this landing go so bad to begin with? The weather was okay, but it was a low visibility. Well, it was a night landing, so the visibility was not that great. The pilot's working with a heads-up display helmet, one of the modern helmet designs that has built-in heads-up display to help cue you in to the instrument approach for the airport runway and landing. Besides the fly-by-wire flight controls, you have the auto throttle control, or at least we call it auto throttles in the airline industry. The throttle is also fly-by-wire controlled, and the throttle needs to be in the correct mode for landing. In the case of the F-35, there's a throttle mode called Approach Power Compensator, APC mode. That's the mode that the F-35 needs to be in to properly do a landing. I'm not sure if this is autopilot on, or I believe this is autopilot off. Regardless, the throttle control needs to be in APC mode. Another degraded mode of auto throttle operation is called speed hold. It's going to hold a set speed. In this case, this aircraft was in speed hold set 202 knots. And it's prohibited per the F-35 manual to land the aircraft in speed hold. Normally, when you get about 3 miles out or the final approach fix, you switch from speed hold mode to APC mode. And that gets the auto throttle in the correct mode for landing and allows it to control the speed correctly to obtain your landing speed. If you leave it in speed hold and don't change it over, it's just going to hold 202 knots. So this pilot had a number of distractions. It's nighttime, he's tired, and the heads-up display helmet is misaligned with the runway. It's not lining up correctly, and now he's also having a hard time visually acquiring the runway. During all this happens at the worst possible moment, right there at the final approach fix. So he's distracted, and he fails to get the aircraft from speed hold mode, the auto throttles, from speed hold mode over to APC mode. So it holds the aircraft at 202 knots, and he comes smoking in on the approach. A couple bits of background on the pilot. This pilot is a former F-15E pilot. Air Force pilots typically, you don't get a lot of flying time in the Air Force. So this guy is a flight instructor in the F-35 with only 1,459 hours total time, of which 1,272 hours are in the F-15E. So he's going to get in a bit of a panic situation here and tend to revert to some of his F-15E habits. And this is something that happens in your Air Force career progression, is once you come from a major weapon system to another major weapon system, you are promoted to instructor pilot pretty quickly, and that's the case with this guy. He's got just a little over 200 hours or so in the F-35, and he's already an instructor pilot in the F-35. And in fact, he was teaching on this sortie. By the way, the sortie was also changed. It was going to be one training profile, and at pretty much the last minute was switched over to another training profile. It went from a red 2x2 sortie to a blue 2x2 sortie. We'll get C.W. Lemoyne to explain all that, or it's all in the report. He went from being an adversary to an allied, playing the role of an allied pilot in a two-ship instructional role. So all these different little factors accumulate into one big snowball on short final. The mishap pilot comes smoking in at 202 knots, and he does not realize that he's coming in too hot and too high. He does not realize that he is still in throttle hold mode or speed hold mode. He's used to seeing this kind of fast picture from the F-15E. He's done it before in the simulator, approaching this fast before, but he's a full 50 knots too fast, coming in at a very low angle of attack, not the angle of the glide slope, but the angle of attack on the wing of the aircraft. That puts the F-35 aircraft slightly out of the normal parameters for a normal landing, further confusing the flight control system. He bounces, and he begins to put he put full aft control in to recover from the bounce. After a bit of flailing around, the stabilizer input became overwhelmed, and it commanded basically full nose down stabilizer control. Despite the pilot holding full nose back, after a couple of seconds, he elected to eject. By the way, he also had full burner in, full aft stick, and the aircraft is heading back for another bounce. So let me read this one section from the report about when the stuff hit the fan. The mission pilot attempted to reestablish a landing attitude after touchdown. This is the first bounce. The aircraft landing lasted approximately 5 seconds before the mission pilot elected to eject. Upon touchdown, the mission pilot initially attempted to dampen the rapid rise of the nose produced by the first bounce. In other words, I believe he gave it a little bit of nose down input. The mission pilot's initial reaction was consistent with attempting to recover from a bounce and set a landing attitude. However, the mission pilot's stick inputs quickly fell out of sync with the aircraft pitch oscillations and control cycles initiated by the weight on wheels. This is where the phase of flight logic is getting confused, and the aircraft control laws, well, there's a lot to be learned about the aircraft control laws in this particular phase of flight. The aircraft control laws became saturated and unresponsive, and ultimately biased the flight control surfaces towards nose down. At the 2-second mark, the mission pilot set and held aft stick to try to reestablish the landing attitude. And that's typically what you do on a bounce. You try to arrest the bounce, but then you want to pull the stick back and just let the aircraft come back down and land on the main wheels and not start a wheelbarrow. The horizontal stabilizer's trailing edges remained full deflection towards nose down despite the pilot holding aft stick. The mission pilot was unable to overcome the nose down bias in order to reestablish a landing attitude or execute a go-around. I love this quote. This is fly-by-wire stuff, man. This is the future right here. The mission pilot reported feeling confused, helpless, and ignored by his own aircraft. 3 seconds of pilot flight control input was not enough time to overcome the saturation caused by 2 seconds of the prior inputs. The flight control system failed to orient the aircraft to the appropriate attitude for a go-around and thus avoid catastrophic loss of the aircraft. After 3 seconds of attempting to go around and after multiple and progressively worsening bounces, the mission pilot released the stick to eject, and he did successfully eject from that aircraft. And let me find the price tag here. Here it is at the beginning of the report. The mission pilot was able to successfully eject before the mission aircraft, valued at $175,983,949, caught fire, and was completely destroyed. So, fascinating report. I hope I'll leave the link here below. Check it out. There's lots to learn about here. A fascinating look into technology, fly-by-wire, flight control systems, and the human interface. There's other issues involved with the F-35. There's the old oxygen issue. Apparently there's some fatigue issues with the demand breathing oxygen system on the F-35. That's another contributing factor in this accident. Plus even the COVID-19, the pilot was concerned about an acquaintance of an acquaintance getting the COVID-19, and the testing was getting close to him. So many different contributing factors on this. Check it out. I hope this helps help you understand it. I got to catch a flight and get home, take 48 hours off, come back and hit the sim. See you here.